So Wes is a wonderful local videographer. He comes and attends a lot of events. And he'll post today's talk on YouTube. I know some people couldn't attend because of something else going on right now. So I'll be putting that link on our Facebook page. You can follow us on Facebook, and I'll put it in the next newsletter. If you have previously signed up for a newsletter and didn't get it, it's probably because it got kicked back because I couldn't read your email. So if you can just email me, we'll get you back on the newsletter list. And so we are so honored and privileged to have this talk today, and very timely talk. And it's the perfect place to have it with us celebrating our 100th year. So, Ruth, it's all yours.
Thank you, Pam and Arlene. I want to thank all of you for coming today. Some of you came from quite far away, and I'd like to thank the JACL Monterey Peninsula for hosting us. We are honored to be here to help celebrate the 100th anniversary of this hall. I'd also like to thank the Friends of Topaz and the Topaz Museum for helping to fund this event. Before I start, I'd just like to find out if there are any camp survivors in the audience. Please raise your hand. Are you a Topaz survivor? Yeah, okay.
I was only 5.
And is there anyone from Poston? No? Okay. How many camp descendants are in the audience? Okay, great. What about, bear with me, what about, is there anyone whose family was a so-called voluntary evacuee? In other words, they left the military zone, exclusion zone on the West Coast before the forced removal? Oh, okay. We have one back there. Great. And last question. Is there anyone whose family repatriated to Japan during or at the end of the war? Okay. All right, thank you very much. Your presence is very meaningful here because, one of the main reasons we started this project is because we wanted to assure the survivors of Topaz that their stories would not die, that we would keep them alive, and we would pass them on to succeeding generations. So thank you. Before we start, and before I introduce our special guests, I'd like to give a quick background of the Topaz Stories project and our motivation behind it. So in about 2013, a group of volunteers in the San Francisco Bay Area, mostly the East Bay, started organizing these fundraising events to raise money for the building of the Topaz Museum in Delta, Utah. And at these events, they would share some of their personal family stories for the people who came. And after that, they decided it would be great to start collecting more stories. And they thought it was particularly important because the survivors were aging and they wanted to capture the stories before it was too late. They didn't make a lot of progress in those first few years, but in 2018, they asked me if I would become the editor of the project. And as a Topaz descendant myself, I jumped at the opportunity. My mother's entire family was in Topaz. My grandparents, my mom, my aunt, and my uncle. So I had a very personal interest in this project. There was also a sense of urgency in 2018. If you can remember what was going on then. It was 1 year into the Trump administration, and many of us felt that history was repeating itself, that what happened to us in 1942 was happening again to others, like Muslims. There was a Muslim ban and so forth. Families were being separated at the border. Children were being incarcerated in subhuman conditions. In 2016, a spokesperson for a Trump super PAC actually cited the Japanese-American internment as a precedent for implementing a Muslim registry, which, as you all know, they implemented that for Japanese way back before World War II, and that's what made the forced removal so easy. Anyway, so we started collecting stories, and they were on my hard drive, on my computer, and I thought, this is great, we're getting stories, but we're not sharing them. So we had an opportunity in 2019 to have our first exhibit at the JACL Cultural Center in Emeryville. So we had that exhibit in 2019, and as you know, COVID hit in 2020, and in the beginning of 2021, there was a surge in anti-Asian violence across the country, and it was fanned by political rhetoric. You know, people calling COVID the China virus, etc., and people didn't distinguish among Asians, they were like attacking everybody. So that added to our sense of urgency to get these stories out there, and at that time I created a website. I'll show you the link later, so that we could put all of our stories online and people all over the world could access them at any time. In the year 2022, we had a year-long exhibit at the Utah State Capitol in Salt Lake City, which was great timing because that was the 80th anniversary of Executive Order 9066. So there was a great deal of public interest in the incarceration. What differentiates Topaz Stories, our project, from many other projects is that we don't just present facts and figures about the incarceration. And these are not oral histories, although many are based on excerpts from oral histories. I wanted to tell stories about regular people in irregular circumstances, and to reveal not only the diversity within our community, but the feelings of various individuals of all ages who were rounded up and incarcerated en masse without due process in 1942. Facts and figures may increase knowledge, but storytelling has the power to create empathy. And I've always felt that empathy is the superpower that enables us to bridge different realities. To that end, I have tried to preserve the stories in the storyteller's own voices, which brings me to a note about terminology. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah. So the WRA, which was the War Relocation Authority, the government organization that was responsible for executing and managing the incarceration program, used certain euphemisms to talk about what they were doing, partly to make what they were doing more acceptable to the American public. So they called places like Tan Fran and Salinas, etc., they called the whole forced removal effort relocation or evacuation, making it sound like a corporate, you know, when you change locations because you're changing your job, or a natural disaster that's actually saving you from something, when in fact it really was a forced removal. Also, internment itself is not an accurate term because it usually is meant to apply to enemy aliens who are being incarcerated, but actually two-thirds of the people who were detained behind barbed wire were American citizens. Yeah, so assembly centers like Tan Fran were not just assembly gathering places, they were temporary detention centers where people were initially put because the whole program was implemented in such haste that they didn't have anywhere to put these people. So while they were building these more permanent camps and locations in the interior, places like the desert of Utah and places like that, people were stayed in assembly centers or, temporary detention centers for usually about 6 months. And then the relocation centers were what they call places like Topaz. And actually, according to the dictionary, they were concentration camps because they were targeting a specific group of people and detaining all of them. So please keep this in mind. My editorial policy when I was collecting these stories is that I preserved whatever terms the storyteller used, because we used those WRA euphemisms for decades after the war, and actually many people still use them. So I kept that, because to impose contemporary jargon on it would be sort of jarring, and it would take us out of the time. So keep that in mind when you're listening to these stories, because you'll hear several, maybe a mixture of terms. I'm going to introduce each guest who will share their or someone else's story. And then after that, we'll open up the program for questions and answers. Okay. So let me start by introducing the first story. Next slide, please. Last year, I was introduced to Ritsuko Furuya by one of my Topaz storytellers who attended the same church. Ritsuko gave us a very personal story about her family, and the backdrop for the story was Lompoc, California, where her family lived before the war. Perhaps nowhere was the economic motive behind the removal of Japanese Americans from California more clearly illustrated than in the story of Lompoc. In the 1920s and 30s, a small but thriving Japanese American community had become very successful at growing and shipping produce. The operator of a rival and only non-Japanese American packing shop became a leading voice for the removal of the Japanese American population and profited greatly from it. This was the background against which Ritsuko's story took place. Her story resonates strongly with events that are happening today. Her family was among the voluntary evacuees. Today we refer to that as self-deportation. Although Ritsuko could not join us today, when I asked her if she would come, she said, "I'm too old," so she's not here. But I really wanted to share her story. And so Sansei artist and Topaz descendant Naomi Kubota Lee has kindly agreed to read Ritsuko's story, Taken Away.
I'm very honored to read her story. It resonates with me and my parents and my grandparents. 28 Issei men were arrested in Lompoc, California, after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. My father, Masazo Furuya, was one of them. Lompoc is a city about halfway between Santa Barbara and Morro Bay. Before it was Lompoc, it was Lompoco, and then Rancho Lompoc, reflecting its Chumash, Spanish, and Mexican heritage. In 1941, my father was working for the Guadalupe Produce Company, a Japanese-owned farm founded in 1923 by Setsuo Aratani, an Issei from Hiroshima. When he was arrested, my father was 40 years old. He had a wife, Yoneko, and 4 children. Me, Ritsuko, which I was almost 5, Mikio, 3.5, Seiji, who was 2, and Naoko, who was almost 3 months old. When the Issei men from Lompoc were taken away, no one knew why or where they had been taken to. What I remember the most vividly was when the FBI came to arrest my father. They handcuffed him. As they were taking him away from the house, my little brother, Mikio, wrapped his arms around the FBI agent's leg to try to stop him from taking our father away. Without my father, my mother had to face the forced removal alone. She asked friends for help and was advised to escape California before everyone was put into the camps. So, with the brand new car that the family had just purchased before the war started, she packed up her 4 children and joined a group led by Fred Wada. He was a produce dealer from Oakland. This group formed a cooperative farming colony, Keatley Farms, on land leased in Utah. They were determined to avoid the camps by making a go of it by raising produce. But my mother found the conditions in Keatley to be terrible. The family's housing was a shack. So in September of 1942, our family entered Topaz Relocation Center in Utah. Meanwhile, we had learned that my father was imprisoned in a Department of Justice internment camp at Fort Lincoln in Bismarck, North Carolina. He was later transferred to Lordsburg, New Mexico. When the U.S. Army decided to recruit Japanese Americans from the camps, they issued the infamous loyalty questionnaire, which was supposed to determine whether individuals were loyal to the United States or Japan. So those are 2 questions. My father was angered by it. He wanted to answer no and no to question 27 and 28. But my mother persuaded him to answer yes, yes, as she wanted to remain in the United States after the war. In July of 1943, my father was released and joined us at Topaz. It had been almost a year and a half since we had seen him. My brother Mikio and I remember him, but my younger siblings did not, and they ran away when he tried to approach them.
Thank you, Melanie. Fort Lincoln was actually in Bismarck, North Dakota. Our second story is by May Takashima, and regrettably, last week May had a fall and was in so much pain that she was not able to come today. She was really disappointed, but very graciously, Kimi Kodani Hill, who is a Topaz descendant, agreed to share May's story with you. And I met May in 2024, 2 years ago, at a Topaz Stories event about a Swedish immigrant named Ella Handrik, who was an artist. And she actually lived in Topaz in one of the administrator's barracks because she was married to Walter Handrik, who was the manager of the Topaz Co-op. And she sketched daily life in Topaz. So Ella Handrik's granddaughter came to one of our events in Emeryville in 2024 and did a little presentation about her grandmother's art. So May heard about that and she really wanted to attend it. She's in her, I think, mid-90s now. And she wanted to come because Ella Handrik was her 7th grade teacher in Topaz. So at the event, May stood up and she said, you know, Ella, your grandmother was my teacher, and she had a picture of her school class. And when I saw that, I thought, I really got the sense that Topaz was very important to her. And so a couple of weeks after that, I contacted her and I went to her house and I listened to her memories of Topaz, and this is what we came up with. So Kimi is going to be May's story. Topaz was my home.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you, JACL Hall, hosting us. It's an honor to read May's story. I've met her a couple times, and when I read through reviewing this, like, oh yeah, she and I went to the same high school. Of course, I went to Oakland Tech from 1970, but she was there too. So this is her story, my voice, but her story. I celebrated my 10th birthday in the grandstand at Tampharan Racetrack. Of course, it wasn't a racetrack anymore, but a detention camp for Japanese Americans. Instead of horses, families lived in the stables and newly built barracks. Next. Before the war, my family lived on Kiri Street in Japantown in San Francisco. My father, Takeo Saito, worked as a dishwasher in a restaurant on Market Street. My mother, Kikwe, was a housewife. I was the eldest child. After me came Jane, Toru, Walter, and Ben, who was born in March 1942. After Executive Order 9066 came out, we were taken to Tampharan Assembly Center. All I remember about being taken away was that I wasn't able to carry anything because I held a sibling in each hand. In September 1942, we were taken to Topaz. It was hot. Old people would walk to the washroom with washcloths on their heads because of the heat. But I got used to it. I sometimes got caught in a dust storm which arose suddenly. I would head to the nearest latrine, but it was hard to open the door because the wind was pushing against it. In the mess hall, everyone sat wherever there was room, so families seldom sat together. Of the food, I remember pork and beans and rice at every meal. People had to stand in line for everything, meals, showers. Some young women would shower in the afternoon, which was less busy for privacy as there were no shower curtains. Some families had a chamba, a portable toilet, in the apartment so they wouldn't have to walk outside in the middle of the night. Someone once reported a coyote in the latrine. I spent most of my time in Topaz playing with friends. We generally stayed within our own block and didn't venture out of it, but my younger brother Toru was mischievous and used to sneak out of the camp to explore the desert. Next. When we first arrived in Topaz, barracks were still being built and there was nothing. But by the time we left in 1945, Topaz had been transformed by the hard work of the Japanese prisoners and had become home. It was pretty. There were gardens and trellises that the Issei had created and a large pond in the middle of the camp. I didn't want to leave. For my younger siblings, Topaz was the only home they had ever known. Next. When we returned to San Francisco after the war, we were housed in government dormitories in Hunters Point in San Francisco. The room only had beds and a pull-down table. We couldn't cook. There was a cafeteria, but we couldn't afford to eat there, so we would go up the hill to a market, buy a loaf of bread, sandwich filling, and mustard, and come back to the dorm and make sandwiches on the pull-down table. Then we would sit on our beds and eat. My dad found a job as a janitor, and eventually someone got a rice cooker, so we were able to have rice. I started attending Everett Junior High in San Francisco. I had a hard time, as I had spoken mainly Japanese with my family and often didn't understand the teacher. Going from a cramped barrack to a large urban school was disorienting. Two black teenagers, Clara Williams and Blanche Anderson, took me under their wing and started showing me how to get around. Next. After 6 months at Hunter's Point, we were moved to government housing in Richmond. We lived in the Japanese Row. There was a row for black families, a row for migrants from Oklahoma. We would cook there. We could cook there, and we lived there for maybe a year until we could afford a house in Berkeley. I worked as a schoolgirl in Piedmont. Like many other young Nisei women, I did household tasks in exchange for room, board, and $30 a month. While I went to school, I attended Oakland Tech and took business courses because I knew I would have to get a job to help my family, who were still living in housing in Richmond, and I married in 1951. Topaz was my home. I have wonderful memories of my life there. Now I realize how hard it must have been for the elders. I have returned twice. Until I revisited Topaz, I felt something was missing, but after going back, I felt complete. Even though nothing remained of the camp but the desert, I would like to go back one more time with my great-granddaughter, Lily Bell, who is now 10, the same age that I was when I was incarcerated in Tanforan. What would you take? I once asked Lily Bell in the course of talking about my experiences during the war. My doll, Lily Bell replied. And that is Lily Bell in the foreground because we met her at the previous Topaz Stories event. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kimi. Our next guest perhaps came the farthest of anyone to attend today. She flew all the way in from Kyoto, Japan. I met her at the 2025 Day of Remembrance program in San Francisco. I just happened to sit next to a Japanese woman, and we started conversing. I found out that she was a professor emeritus of Japanese American history and literature in Kyoto, Japan, and she was in San Francisco on a visit. She was also a Sansei and a Topaz survivor. As her remarkable story emerged, I knew I would have to follow up to learn more. A couple of months later, I took a rather spur-of-the-moment trip to Japan and arranged to meet Kyoko in Kyoto. That's what I said. Where she and her husband live. We're honored that she's come all the way from Japan to share her father's story with us today. Please welcome Kyoko Nozaki.
Thank you all for coming, not all the way, but probably from local area, but still taking time to come this lovely Saturday afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Put it a little closer.
I'm a university professor, and I'm not very conventional in Japan, and so I usually just walk around to see how students react, make sure that they don't fall asleep. So when I was attending UC Berkeley, I met many Japanese Americans, and very often I heard them ask questions like, which camp was your family in? And the word camp puzzled me, because that was the first time I actually learned about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Of course, I knew that I was born in the United States, Oakland, California, in 1939, and then we had lived in Japan since 1946, when I was 6 years old in Japan. But my parents never speak of camp. So on my next visit home, I asked my father, were we in the camps? And he said, of course you were. Well, you never told me. You never asked. So thankfully, my father lived to be 101-year-old, and so I had plenty of time to ask more questions. And so here is my father's story. Yes, this is my father. Tsutomu Tanigawa, known as Storm to his friends, was born in Watsonville, California in 1909. His parents, Montaro and Sumo, had emigrated from Fukuoka Prefecture in 1904 to work on sugarcane plantation in Hawaii. 2 years later, they moved to Watsonville, where their second son, my father, Tsutomu, was born. He grew up in a multi-ethnic community where his friends were of many different backgrounds, German, Portuguese, Spanish. Storm did not consider himself very Japanese, preferring to read in English, swimming in the river rather than attending Japanese language school, eating American food like meat and potatoes over traditional Japanese dishes. He still thinks that sushi is bad for you. Raw fish. And seeing American movies, that's his favorite time. Once he, and then I told the other story, but I'll just skip that. But Tanigawa grew strawberry, he and his brother and other several siblings, eventually saving enough to buy a house and some land in Japan. While my grandparents returned home to Fukuoka, my father and Kazuo, his elder brother, stayed in the United States to finish high school. Next. They continued story farming, moving eventually to Mount Eden, now a part of Hayward, I heard, in search of fresh soil. While visiting his parents in Japan in 1936, Tsutomu met and married my mother, Katsuie Kuratomi, a Kibei nursing student who had been born in Oxnard, California. They returned to California where my brother Hiroshi and I were born. May already showed you the questionnaire, but this is actually from a copy I got from a National Archives and my father's documents. Following Executive 9066, our family was first imprisoned at Tanforan Assembly Center in the spring of 1942, then transferred to Topaz Relocation Center in Utah, where we stayed for a year. In the spring of 1943, the U.S. government circulated the infamous loyalty questionnaire to question 27 and 28 about the willingness to serve in the American forces armed forces and for swearing allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. My father answered no and no, but he also added, like you can see here, handwritten note, which he kept telling me, but I never actually half believed, until I actually acquired this document from National Archives. And it says, this does not mean I'm against America. I shall like to go to Japan to live with my parents and farm after the war. Next. But wartime leaves no room for nuance. In September 1943, our family file was marked TS, transferred to segregation. And we were sent to Turtle Lake, the designated camp for those deemed, quote, disorder. My father was disillusioned by the way he had been treated by the country of his birth. Later in his life, he often said, they should have asked the question before they placed us into camp. Shortly afterward, my father was arrested by the FBI and sent to the Department of Justice prison at Fort Lincoln. Like I remember, one of the audience said, Fort Lincoln, Bismarck, North Dakota, where I have been going several times to do my research. Now, meanwhile, my mother, my brother, and I remain in Turtle Lake. Hiroshi, my elder big brother, a boy in circular, boy with suspender, was on the Block 69 baseball team, his youngest member. He was not even 9, to be sure. Being separated from his family was hard on my father. He regretted that he could not be with us to watch Hiroshi play baseball, or he spent many hours in the woodworking factory at Fort Lincoln and made pencil boxes for us. I remember we had that for a long time. One for me was decorated with a little girl and a puppy, that was mine, and another with a little boy in a baseball uniform holding a ball and a bat. That's for my brother Hiroshi. The camp also showed Hollywood movies almost every night, offering prisoners a brief escape. We did not see my father until we were reunited on board the USS Gordon in late December 1945, having elected to repatriate to Japan. This is almost like my last picture with my brother in camp. Back in Fukuoka, we joined my grandparents. My bilingual dad was recruited by the occupation forces as an interpreter. He had lost over 2 years with us. I was 6. My brother Hiroshi he was like an 8.5, before he could finally play catch with his son. I adjusted easily to first grade, but for Hiroshi, the transition was more difficult. His language, his clothes, his manner, all mark him different, and he had a hard time making friends. His father was one of the only people he could talk to. Then, just 5 months after our return to Japan, exactly that was May 1946, tragedy struck. While running to meet his father at the station, Hiroshi was killed in an accident as he jumped down from the delivery wagon. His clothing got caught in the wheel, and he was pulled underneath and was crushed. It devastated my parents. My mother was never the same. For my father, Hiroshi's death became his one deep regret about returning to Japan. After the occupation was dissolved in a year, my father's American boss introduced him to a company that distributed American films, a rare and valuable entertainment resource in post-war Japan. My dad became a general manager. In 1954, Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio visited Japan on their honeymoon. My father was asked to greet them, and he asked me if I would like to meet them. I was given a bouquet of flowers to present to Marilyn. I visited her a room in International Hotel in Fukuoka, and she smiled at me. And everybody asked me later, what did you think of her? And I thought she was the most beautiful woman I ever met. Her waist was like this small. She smiled at me and autographed a photo to Norma, which is my middle name. I was thrilled to find that we share a name, which was just a coincidence, but although my father had long been fans. This is the last picture, yes. The picture was taken on his 99th birthday. We had a special celebration called a White anniversary, because the character White is one stroke short of 100. So White celebration. And though my father's anger at the U.S. government for its treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II never faded, neither did his love for all things American. He just loved all that American food. Peanut butter, salami. He used to go to the convenience store to buy all the food that was typical of teenager stuff, and everybody just kind of laughed. But anyway, he encouraged me to study in the United States, believing his educational system was superior, and that's why I ended up coming out here and then the 6 months in James Vick High School in San Jose, and then to UC Berkeley, where I got my undergraduate degree. And every year until his death in 2011, he wrote a Bank of America check to mail order seized candies for his friends and relatives during the holiday season. Thank you for sharing my story.
Thank you very much, Kyoko. So, in 2018, we held a Topaz Stories writing workshop. Up until that time, we had relied on our own family networks, our own family stories, our relatives, and personal networks to gather our stories. But that was kind of, we were running out of people to, whose arms to twist. So we wanted to get more people who we weren't related to. So one of the attendees who came was Norm Hayashi. Norm had just turned 3 when he arrived in Topaz in 1942. And he had few memories of his time there. But sometimes the absence of words speaks more powerfully than eloquence. And I knew there was a story buried deep. So in the course of our correspondence over a period of several months, a picture emerged of how events in one's very early life can shape a life. So please welcome Norm Hayashi sharing his story, Every Little Moment.
It was difficult trying to find these photographs in shoe boxes. It was even more difficult looking at them and having various emotions surface after all these years. I was born in 1939, add to that September 11th. So I was 2 to 5 years old duration in camp. What do I remember? All I have is jumbled memories. No cause and effect, just dust, sand, no trees. The noisy, hot, humid mess hall. The taste of graham crackers and ice cold milk at preschool. Later I found out we drank skim milk at home, so anything tastes better. I remember being bullied on my way home from preschool. These guys, 2 boys, looked like 10 feet tall to me. One day I didn't come home at the usual time, so my mom went to school and found me goofing around at school, killing time. After that day, she met me where these 2 guys were waiting for me every day. It almost seemed there were too many people around, especially girls and women. There was a lack of male. I was very embarrassed to have to take showers with my mom and other ladies. Even at that young age, I knew there was a difference. I complained to my mom, and she found a male friend who took me to showers after that. Our family union in camp consisted, this is my pre-World War II family and my life through 6th grade. consisted of my paternal grandparents, Hirokachi and King Hayashi, my uncle Warren Hayashi, perhaps 19 years old, my dad Henry, my mom Aiko Alice, and as a side note, this was an arranged marriage. There were nieces, but it was an arranged marriage. Myself, I'm the oldest of 4 siblings. My brother Gerald was born 1942, so he was took part in an evacuation a year later. And my brother Patrick was born 1944 in camp. My sister Marilyn wasn't born until 1948. The main thread passing through all these photos is that my mom was a very pretty girl and always seemed happy. She always had a, I don't know how to explain it, but I felt good around her. But also I remember later, after the war, I was being very sick often. And her lack of energy impacted our lives as kids. She was bedridden in her last few years. That would be my junior and my high school years, and died at the early age of 39. My dad also seemed self-assured and happy too in these camp pictures. I mean, whatever. He had a tremendous burden to carry, and with 4 young kids and elderly parents, I don't know how he did it. My dad is not in these pictures. When cleared, people were allowed to resettle to work outside of camp. So my dad and my uncle both went to Chicago to work in the shipyards, building ships for U.S. What that left to my family is the 2 major males to discipline those kids. You know, we got away with a lot, my mom and my grandparents. My mom had to assume all the care of my grandparents and 3 young boys. Occasionally, my dad would return for a short visit. I remember one time I was very scared of him and wouldn't go near him. My mom and my grandparents laughingly urged me to go up to him. Eventually, I guess I did. I always felt those years of separation affected my later relationship with my dad. We could never talk on a real intimate level. Could I blame Topaz for this? I don't know. I ended up working side by side with my dad and my uncle in their family business for 30 years. We all became closer, but with my dad, I never felt that father and son connection. All my life, I didn't like to do things over and repeat, rehash past events. I had too much to do in the present. Going through many rough years with my own ill health, I was asthmatic, and changing of my lifestyle styles. For lack of better words, I tend to live too much in the moment. I finally realized life is very complex, and almost every little moment defines our current lives. I asked Ruth if I can add this. I got a little too heavy on my dad, and a lot of it, when I think about it, it's the way he was. Very, very quiet. Never criticized, and he never praised either. Because one working, my uncle would tell my dad, he did a good job putting that 8-inch pipe in. And I thought to myself, why can't my dad say the same thing? And I broke my hip, whatever this is, a ball joint. and I was in the hospital 10 days, the first one. My dad would come in and say hi, a couple things, how you doing, okay? And then he'd fall asleep in the corner. And I'd have to wake him up at closing time to go home. But when I think back, he did that every time I ended up in the hospital. He was there. And that was his way of acknowledging my injury, I guess. I don't know. I think the war, the camp itself, it created the environment for these things to fester and develop. But I don't have any political reasons or things. I was just simply too young. No. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norm. So our final story is by John Yatabe, who lives in, actually he divides his time between Alaska and Colorado, so he was not able to join us either. In fact, I just got a photo from him this morning by email, taken in Fort Collins, Colorado, at a No Kings demonstration. In May of 2023, I received a one-line email from John, whose memoir had been a rich source of Topaz Stories since 2018. The email said, "Has anyone ever written about the Duvenets?" I had no idea who they were, so I asked for more information. And together with John's memories and my online research, we created the story called Two Camps. At a point in our national history when mass incarceration threatens to expand unchecked, I'm sorry to say that we need stories like this more than ever. So this is Two Camps by John Yatabe. Just after we got out of Topaz, I'm going to read the story because John can't be here. And that's John and his mother in the picture, and that's his father, Tak, on the left, who was fighting in Europe with the 442. Just after we got out of Topaz, and before my dad was discharged from the army, my mother and I were invited to a place called Hidden Villa in the Santa Clara Valley, south of San Francisco. It was a ranch owned by a couple named the Duvenets, who were starting a summer camp for kids from all different backgrounds. I was 8 years old. My dad was serving in the 442 in Europe. He had left Topaz in 1943 to join up, and we'd seen him only once since then, when he visited us in camp on leave after being wounded in 1944. My dad was still in Europe when my mom and I left Topaz in June 1945 to return home to Berkeley, where my grandparents had lived before the war. Before getting on the train in Utah to go home, we went to a restaurant for something to eat before the long train ride ahead. My mom ordered a single steak, and the nice waiter let us share it. He brought the steak divided on 2 separate plates, each with a baked potato and vegetables, saying, "You've been through a lot. Enjoy." He even added pie for dessert. That was the best steak dinner I ever had, or will have. We were met on the other end by Marion Collins, the wife of Larry Collins, a Quaker Red Cross representative who helped my dad in Europe when he was wounded. Larry had contacted Marion and asked her to pick us up when we got off the train. We were lucky because the Bank of Berkeley had rented Grandpa's house out while we were gone, so we had a place to come back to. We were finally home, waiting for my dad and hoping he would return safely from the war. So when my mom told me that we were going to spend a few days at a camp, I wondered why, since we had just gotten out of one. But my mom assured me that it was a different kind of camp. I didn't know anything about the Juvenex, but when we arrived, we were welcomed by the family and the counselors. There were other Topaz kids there, as well as all kinds of other kids, including, I later learned, Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany. I remember being awed by how grand the house was. I had never seen anything so magnificent. I saw a portrait of Frank Duveneck Sr., or Grandpa, who was an artist. Mrs. Duveneck, Josephine, was in charge of the camp, helped by her two daughters, Liz and Liz. We kids nicknamed for Hope, the elder daughter. I had my first swimming lesson there and ran races with all kinds of kids. At night, there was folk dancing and music. I even got to ride a horse for the first time. It was tame, but huge, and smelled strong, so I was a little scared. When I got off after my ride, the horse took a step back and stepped on my foot. Liz was leading the riders and heard me yell and rushed back. She tore off my shoe and sock and felt the bones. Nothing was broken, just a bruise. And I rode again the next day. I didn't know until many years later that Josephine Duveneck was from a Quaker background. And in addition to running the Hidden Valley camp, she and her husband were active in the American Friends effort to fight racial covenants in local housing. When she had the idea of a multiracial camp for kids, friends were skeptical, saying it would never work. It seemed to me, she wrote, if one could get hold of children before prejudice intervened, there might be a good chance to prevent its development. I'm now in my 80s, but I have wonderful memories of my time at Hidden Villa, at a camp that was so different from the one where we had been incarcerated during the war, that you had to wonder how the same word could apply to both. The two camps were at opposite ends of the spectrum, the products of the worst and the best aspects of human nature. And I guess it made me believe that we have a choice. We can give in to the fear and hate and cause great harm to individuals, children, families, or we can choose to be like the Juvenecks, kind, visionary, and try to make the world a little better, if only by offering a brief respite in troubled times. Thank you. That's John's story. So in closing, I'd like to thank Naomi and Kini for standing in for May and Ritsuko, who couldn't join us today. And special thanks to May, Kyoko, Norm, Ritsuko, and John for having the courage to remember and in some cases excavate such personal stories. These aren't just stories about the past. Our stories are a reminder that democracy is fragile and that we have to be vigilant in its defense. 84 years ago, few came to our aid in our time of need. But we can learn from the past. We can learn the ramifications in human terms when a specific group is targeted by hate and fear. And we can learn how people like the Juvenecks or the waiter in Salt Lake City who served John and his mother a meal he has never forgotten, how to fight back through acts of kindness, large and small. Most importantly, we have to apply what we learn from these stories and from history to the present. We have to show up, speak out, in other words, do something. And each of us in our own way can do something. The JACL of Monterey Peninsula is doing something. They've kept this JACL Hall going despite efforts to erase the histories and contributions of communities like ours. And reaching the 100-year mark is indeed a cause for celebration. And if we open the doors today and we will see millions of Americans showing up and speaking out. Each of us in our own way can and must do something. So imagine if in 1942, millions of Americans had taken to the streets against our forced removal and incarceration. How would our lives have been different? So on that note, I'd like to introduce Kimi again, who is going to moderate questions and answers.
Yeah, and thank you, Ruth, for, all. Ruth is our amazing editor who drives the website and keeps it updated. And for that flyer or the program, there is the Topaz Stories website number, and you can easily find it on the website. So I hope you'll scroll through and check out some of the other stories. Yes.
Just a question for Kyoko, and I was wondering if your father ever received the $20,000 reparation money?
We all did.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for asking that questions. In fact, I use that material often to Japanese audience, because they're interested in what the American government did. And we actually filed, so then my brother was already gone, so 3 of us each got $20,000. And for my mother, it was a really big thing. That was probably the largest amount of money she ever received in her lifetime.
Thank you. It's Kyoko.
Yes.
I'm just curious, and maybe it's dense of me, but so were you able to hold dual citizenship passports, and whether or not, how do you find traveling back and forth? It seems like you still do a lot.
Right. Japan is one of the few countries, advanced country, that do not really recognize the dual citizenship. So if I ever have a position at National University as a Japanese, that automatically annul my American citizenship. So, but many other countries approve the multiple citizenship, and therefore, and often they say, "Oh wow, you were born before the war, so that probably is okay." Many people were not aware that you're allowed dual citizenship. So when I traveled from Japan to the United States, I exist as a Japanese. When I enter the United States, they have to, and I have to show their American passport. So I actually carry 2 passports. But these days, when I travel abroad, I go to Europe, North America, different places, and I most often go as a Japanese because it's more, safer that way.
I wonder if there are Japanese American organizations that have spoken out about people being sent, of a certain ethnic group, especially being sent to camps now.
Just off the top of my head, there's some, and there's an activist group called Sulu for Solidarity. They're actively, trying to keep the issue front and center. JACL also is always monitoring. Yeah, and it's good that people are making this connection. I mean, right at the beginning, they mentioned the podcast, with Maddow, and they see the connections right away, and that's good. That's why it's so important to have that history embedded in text, in books, and resources, and websites like Topaz Stories. Yeah.
I noticed, I watch NHK, and Japan seems to be a lot less racist than it used to be, especially if you look at the employees. Japan's getting so old, they have to accept a lot. There's 4 million foreigners now living in Japan permanently, more or less permanently. And it's a real change from back in the 50s. Right?
I'm just going to add to that, as I met last year representatives from museums and historians from Wakayama. That was one of the prefectures in Japan that in the 20s, a lot of migration happened. Hiroshima, Wakayama, that southern area. These researchers who are young, 40s, 50 years old, they're so interested in gathering the stories of this Issei migration that happened after the turn of the century, because they say that the young people now growing up in Japan are kind of confused and trying to figure out about this new, as you say, foreigners now living in Japan that have to support agriculture and caring for the elderly, and how that they have no idea that ancestors, that Japanese went to America and had to confront and deal with so much racist policies in America. So sharing these stories, not just for Americans in America learning about the issues of migration, but now also in Japan. That's what I've heard. What do you think?
Yes. I was just going to say something. When I graduated from UC Berkeley and went back to I met my husband at UC Berkeley, Japanese from Japan. And I wanted to work, but it was very difficult for women. It was early 60s to get a position. And so I started working as a secretary because I could type and, I can understand the English and all that. And I have to act as a kind of interpreter for the managers and that. But gradually, then I thought, well, I can make use of my education. So, and then they recruited. First, I became an international conference interpreter. They pay so well, consecutive and interpreter. Then the university professor somehow found out about me, and they said, we wanted some English teacher who can be bilingual and who had this living abroad experience and that. So that's when my academic career started. But I've come a long way. I'm talking about the women's history in Japan. I can write a book about that, But it's good that many Japanese are more interested in Japanese Americans who share histories and that. And also I have several university graduate students who are interested in doing this. And I actually talked to Naomi about that. It's because it's Asian American studies that are relatively new. We were the kind of pioneer in Japan. And so they, not just only they're interested, but it's marketability. Because there are few in that field. So that means they have a better chance of getting a job. I don't blame them, particularly women. Why not make use of whatever you have? And so we've come a long way. And I'm not sure whether you can say that Japan is less prejudiced than, or racist than before. I'm not sure about that.
You're a different generation.
Well, I know the olden days. So it's a lot of improvement. But you'll be surprised how traditional and stubborn some people were.
Well, I think one of the best things that the Prime Minister of China did, Xi Jinping, did was recently Japan and Koreans are treating each other as equals.
That's very true, yes. Because my father still do not recognize Asian American. He always said, oh, there's the Japanese American, Chinese American, that means, he said, there's no such thing as Asian American. So in that way, he's so American, but he's kind of backward. He said a lot of racist things. Dad, you can't say that in Japan.
I was wondering, you had shared about a bill or something that was a precedent for the incarceration camps, and there was that had been already, when you first were speaking, you were talking about the precedent for the registry. What was that? I just wanted to ask you more about what was the registry about?
You mean the one for Japanese?
Yeah, there was the idea of a camp. There was a precedent for that, you said.
Yeah, I'm not a historian, but the incarceration didn't just happen out of nowhere. There was a long history of anti-Asian legislation and discrimination, especially on the West Coast. And one of the things that was discovered is that, I'm not sure if you might know, Kimi, but it could have been the FBI or somebody was actually surveilling Japanese Americans and just kind of spying on, to try to, even before the war. And they started a registry. And so when the time came when, Pearl Harbor was bombed and there was this big movement to round everybody up and ship them off, it was fairly quick because they had all the information.
That's going on, but that wasn't before the war.
Yeah.
It was even before the war.
I don't remember the exact year, but you could probably Google it.
Do we have Karen T. Yamashita here? Because she's academic and she's the expertise in that here. Karen, can you say something about?
I don't exactly know about the registration, but yes, the FBI knew and had all the names, and of course they had gathered them. So the next day after Pearl Harbor, they were able to round up Issei men who were the leaders and of the community, who they were under suspicion. My grandfather was arrested, and he was, like your father, taken away to, where was it? Not to Bismarck, but someplace in Montana. Where is that? Yeah. So, and he was taken away from the family for all those months, and then met them again in Topaz. So yes, the government did know who were the leaders in that community. So making a registration of Muslim folks and knowing where everyone would have been, that's really a problem. But I believe that probably now they do know where all of us are.
Thank you, Karen.
This really isn't a question. I've been reading a little bit about the history of the FBI and that registry list. They started actually accumulating this in 1926, and they had an A, B, C list. They had 3 levels. Of course, the A were the most, they thought that they were the most, could be the most disloyal because they're Issei, and they were, a lot of them were community leaders or active in the community. So that's how they labeled a lot of those, the prisoners that were taken for the incarceration. Started before the camps were formed.
When is your next pilgrimage to Topaz, and if you went, what would you see?
Okay, I will answer that as the next pilgrimage to Topaz is now closed because we're at our capacity. I'm helping organize, and it's going to be the first weekend of May. And because the nearest town to the actual site, basically 10, 11 concentration camps are very rural, isolated areas. So in the case of Topaz, the town cannot accommodate 150 people visiting. So everybody stays in Salt Lake City, and then a one-day bus ride takes you down, spends the whole day in the Topaz Museum, which was established by the townspeople, and then go out to the camp. Even from the town of Delta, it's still 60 miles out, driving out to Topaz. I really encourage anybody, if you are anywhere in Utah, to take a detour and go visit that particular camp. It is actually pretty intact, not by buildings, but at 4,000 feet high elevation, all the roads, all the concrete pads for the mess halls and the bathrooms are all just sitting out there. It's so clear, you can get on a Google map and see the layout of the camp, and I can identify exactly Block 5, Barrack 9, where my grandparents were. Yeah, it's an interesting camp. All the camps are different, configuration at this point. For us here in California, Manzanar would be maybe the closest. It's on the Eastern Sierra. But yeah, I highly recommend that if you will, I'm just talking to you. Who was I talking to? We're just talking right when we started that the power of place is it's so moving. And I think me at my age now, as I'm in my 70s now, and I love coming to this hall. That power of place. If you can talk about 100-year-old history and a building, but to be here is so special. And to actually be walking around on these camp sites like Manzanar, you can drive and take a tour and think, wow, whatever, 8,000 people were living here. It's very moving. There's a lot of wonderful, deep history, especially in California. So yeah, thank you for helping preserve, the history of Monterey. And I think because we're at the half hour, so we have refreshments if you would like. There's a lot of cookies. And thank you so much for coming today. We really appreciate it.
Kyoko, I do want to mention that the JACL does have a chapter in Japan. So if you know, I'm big on membership. So if you know any Japanese American residing in Japan, let them know that we do have a chapter in Japan.
You're part of our district.
Hint,
hint. Thank you all so much for coming and doing this. It's a very timely topic, and I know you took a large chunk of your day to come here. I really want to thank you and thank all of you for coming and listening to this important talk. Again, as mentioned, there's still refreshments back there, quite a few cookies left. And again, be careful, there is that step down right outside the door. This building was raised about 5 feet many decades ago because of a river running under this building, so that's why it's a weird setup.